Hi, everybody. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, Managing Editor at DevOps.com and DevOps TV, and I am here once again at the DevOps Enterprise Summit 2018 in Las Vegas, having lots of really interesting conversations and meeting some really smart people, including these guys. We're going to be talking a little bit about DevOps, doing DevOps in regulated industries. So to my left is Robin Yeman, who is a Lockheed Martin Fellow at Lockheed Martin. And then next to her is Ken Moser, who works for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and he's Special Assistant to the Applied Technology Division. I had to use my cheat sheet for that title. And then next to Ken is Melinda Solomon, who's the Agile Training Lead at CIS. So thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you.
How's the show been for you guys?
Excellent.
Yeah,
very outstanding.
Good. Great. So, one of the things that I've actually talked to a couple different folks in different industries that are considered, highly regulated, including financial services, and it's interesting to hear kind of their perspectives on doing DevOps and some of the things that they have to consider. But obviously, security has come up as as something that's considered super important, especially in the highly regulated, and compliance is obviously the other. So I'm interested in hearing from you guys how you guys approach DevOps, realizing that there are certain parameters that you do have to meet from the perspective of security and meeting privacy regulations and those other type of regulatory compliance issues.
So for us, what I would tell you is we begin with security, right? So where we talked about test-driven development in the past, we do a lot of security test-driven development. And I would say that the DevOps pipeline is actually even more secure than some of our manual processes, right? So we've been able to build in things like automated fuzz testing, lightweight penetration, teach threat modeling at the team level, which then embeds security in. Because we know that we don't have enough security people to be able to kind of inspect everything at the end.
Our situation at CIS is very similar. We have a number of areas that we have to pay attention to. Cybersecurity is one, privacy, of course. And then for us, a big element is an area that I work in, Section 508, which is accessibility for federal agencies. I don't know. I was trying to figure out how to answer your question exactly. And I'm not really sure because I guess for us, we have to do these things, but we still have to fit them in an Agile and DevOps model. So if I look at 508, which is the area that I work in the most, for us it's been the struggle to move that process as far left in the whole life cycle as possible. So rather than wait until just testing at the end, we've moved the inspection process all the way into the development, where the developers are actually creating a user interface. They have a tool they can use right then and there that can give them advice because it will scan their code. And then we have a scanner that's part of their pipeline that follows up. So if they don't do that, there's another way to enforce it. And then we have a third tool that we can use to do validation afterwards by scanning their entire application or their website. So we've done all three, but the key is to move it as far left as possible. I know for cybersecurity, they've done that too. Back in the day, security was all oriented around authority to operate, which was ATO. It's an event. You have to go through a lot of paperwork and a lot of assessment, and you prove out. And we still do that for a brand new application, but once they have an ATO, they go into ongoing authorization where our security team scans the code that they're developing and scans the production system constantly. And gives them, updated guidance as they get new changes and new threats. So.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that, so I run the training program, so that's my perspective. And so sort of talking a little bit about what Ken was talking about, we actually train our developers in basic accessibility compliance so that they can code compliantly from the beginning. And then we also make sure that all of our IT project managers and product owners understand what auditable Agile should look like. and that they should be expecting their developers to be putting their decision-making notes into the code in Git or in a wiki in Confluence, so that when we do have a circumstance of audit readiness, that we have a source that we can go to that isn't a traditional Word document.
So one of the things that keeps popping up in my conversations with other folks is the idea of, to get complete DevOps buy-in, you actually, it's a huge culture shift. So, within your industries, I mean, government sometimes is not viewed as the most agile environment. So, how did your organizations start to embrace DevOps and get that culture, corporate buy-in?
Well, to get the real backstory, you would have to talk with Mark Schwartz. We were lucky. Mark came into USCIS, and it was his vision to move us out of waterfall into Agile. And I don't know what kind of ninja politician moves he played, but he worked with DHS. I mean, he asked me, I was running IV&V when he came in, and I just shook my head and said, I'm not getting this guidance from DHS. They're looking for more documentation, more reviews. And he said, we're going to have to change that. And I said, Mark, I can't change it for you. And he wasn't, I don't think he was happy to hear that, but he understood it, and he took it on as his mission. And as I said, I'm not sure exactly what he did in the back end, but he did get approval to experiment. And I think through experimentation and proof, he was able to keep it going and expand on it.
So for us, I would say, we think that the government's like that, but actually the three-letter agency, so I worked a lot with the intelligence community, started requiring Agile back in 2002. So I had my very first contract that said thou shalt. And it's really because they've determined that the risk to not having capabilities to the warfighter is higher than not having perfect capabilities, right? So get stuff out faster. Believe it or not, they think it means faster as opposed to being able to adjust and adapt, but you can leverage off that. Now, we've been building the culture since, like I said, 2002, and inherently people tend to be command and control. So we do have to work heavily on building servitude leaders and teaching people to be enablers versus, how to do things. Using things like Kevin or Marquette's book on Turn the Ship Around, there's a few really good results that fit in our world, which people can see themselves in. They're like, oh, so the submarine captain does think that this approach is actually going to deliver better value. Now, we've had to be really careful because most of our customers don't really care about software, right? Software's like this much. We have to deliver working capabilities. So most of the systems we're putting together have hardware, have software, have firmware, electronics, propulsion, hypersonics, right? All of those things. So we have to make it so that everybody feels included. And so that's been a big part of our culture shift, is to make sure that we're all engineers. We all want to solve these complex problems as opposed to just the software developers.
So that it's an interesting point you make about having the hardware and the software and all the other pieces that kind of create the whole. And I've heard others talk about extending DevOps beyond just the software development. So are you seeing kind of the DevOps principles kind of filtering out to other parts of your organization?
So absolutely. One of the things, really if you look at it, came out of Deming's work, right? It's all about lean. Manufacturing got it a little earlier. And then if you start looking at books like Don Reinertson's Principles of Product Development Flow, he says exactly why these practices work, not just for software, but for anything. So for example, I had a team, and one of the things they needed to validate early in the life cycle was that they could put a person's hands with gloves in a rack, in space. So how do we do it? Lightweight prototypes. We do a lot of modeling. So being able to leverage things like continuous integration for modeling and making sure that we have that entire delivery value stream accounted for actually allows us to filter that out. And so a lot of these ideas, while they have some new terms, aren't all new.
At USCIS, we've seen it going in a new direction. So our whole Agile journey started obviously with IT, But now the training programs that Melinda's delivering, more and more of the business side is coming because they want to actually use it not necessarily with their IT projects, but they have other projects. And they've determined already that in looking at what they're doing with Agile, Scrum, or Kanban in IT, hey, this could probably work for us on these other projects too. So that's, I don't know whether they were firmware, hardware, or what they were, but they're looking at using them for entirely different things. So that's been great.
Yeah, we've definitely seen a big increase in interest from other parts of the business of trying to cross-pollinate some ideas from IT and the success that we've had in IT into other parts of the organization.
Okay, all right, yeah, that seems to be, you know, if you look at kind of that DevOps maturity cycle, that, you know, when other organizations and other sections or departments within the organization start to see the value of DevOps, that's when you know
that you're making
it. Yeah, exactly. So that's really great to hear. But you know, when we're just kind of going back to the culture thing for just a second, where do you guys see? I mean, because obviously there's got to be still some kind of pushback from certain areas of the organization. So where do you see that coming from? Is it mostly from kind of the top-down management structure that may be giving a little bit of pushback, or is it more among the folks who are tasked with doing DevOps per se?
It wasn't from our management in our case because it was being pushed by our top person in IT. So that resistance was overcome pretty quickly. For us, I was probably viewed as one of the people that was holding it up initially because I was warning Mark, I've not heard anything like this from DHS. And you know, I'm pretty sure he probably thought I was an obstruction at first, even though that really wasn't my personal view. It just, I knew I'd been fully trained in the DHS lifecycle and was going to their meetings and knew what they were telling us they were expecting. So I was stunned when Mark managed to get that approval to do something entirely different, and gratified but stunned. But for us, another area that probably slowed things up a little is we had multi-year contracts in place that called for them to follow the DHS SELC, the System Engineering Lifecycle. And so we had to actually modify contracts, and then we had to train the staff in the new way that Mark wanted them to work, because a lot of them didn't come on board with that. That wasn't a contract requirement. Right. So that took a while. And I would say, I mean, I've talked to a lot of people at this show and others, and the move from waterfall to Agile, and particularly to DevOps, is not something you're going to get done in a year or two. No. It's a good multi-year effort. In our case, it probably took 5 or 6 years to get there.
And I think one of the current challenges is that as USCIS has truly pivoted to embracing DevOps, in your topic about regulated environments, we have oversight entities that are coming that are not necessarily as well versed in a DevOps culture. So they're looking for evidence of due diligence coming in specific documentation that actually doesn't exist in the way that we do business. And so now we're tasked with the sort of the opportunity to educate the auditors who are coming in about how we can prove due diligence in a new way. And so it means that perhaps those organizations are trailing organizations that need to slowly maybe reimagine what auditing a DevOps organization looks like.
Yes, we talked a little about that in our presentation. I mean, typically when an auditor comes in, they're accustomed to the DHS lifecycle, and their opening question to us is, show us your documentation. And as I said, we're like, don't have any of that. We have a little bit of it, but nothing like what they're expecting. So we need to show them the signals that we're following from the practices, the pipelines, and the production systems to show them that we are doing the governance we need to. We're just doing it differently.
And if you follow things like intent, right, what's the intent? I've actually not had a huge amount of difficulty, right? It's the people that only understand the process, but they don't actually know why they're following the process, right? And we have a lot of that. But if they understand the intent, our security folks, the CERT, they love this because it provides end-to-end transparency that they've never seen in large-scale systems before. So once they start, looking at, well, really I have to show this evidence, it doesn't have to be in this format, that changes the game, right? So focusing on working with our people to make sure they understand what the intent is, where we're trying to go, has been our best approach.
Although in our case, I mean, we have allowed our project teams to adopt some different tools. There are some that are common. Everybody in our organization uses the same GitHub, for example. And we have almost all of them use Jira. It's the DHS Jira. But beyond that, they're allowed to adopt the test tools, the scanning tools, and some of the coding tools that work best for them. So I think one of the problems that some of the auditing organizations have experienced is they're not going to come in and see a nicely formatted Word document. They're going to go look at a log out of one of those systems. And if they're not an engineer, it might not always make sense to them. So we generally have to hold their hand a little bit. And so they've had to go out, a couple of these auditing agencies actually had to bring in a technical person to make sure that we weren't trying to pull the wool over their eyes. And that's okay, we appreciate that. But it is a fact. It's not a nicely formatted Word document with a lot of interpretation anymore. It is the actual raw log files, the raw signals that we're getting. Some of it may be uploaded to a dashboard, but they usually want to see what's behind the dashboard anyway, and it gets right to that quickly.
I would think that's a bit concerning, right? Because we don't want technology driving the business, we want the business driving the business, which means that we as technologists have to provide information in a way that the business can consume it. And so one of the things I worry about is we've got engineers who are like, this is how we're going to do things. No, the business says how we're going to do things. We have to provide consumable content in a format that can be absorbed. That way we're all aligned as opposed to, and that really comes back to, that's why Agile and DevOps isn't for IT or software, it's how you build complex systems and business outcomes, which means we got to get everybody in play.
I agree with you, but remember, I mean, this is not purely an engineer's decision. These are the development teams working with the business, the product owners on the team. They're in fact, their vote's the one that matters the most. So, it's still, though, when an auditor comes in, they might be prepared to look at a stack from one of our projects, but then they decide they want to look at another one and like, well, they don't use the exact same tools. And it may take you a couple hours to figure, we'll show you. We'll lead you by the hand.
Give them the data.
Yeah.
So are you doing value stream mapping then as part of that to kind of...
Yes, we do that. If you look at the techniques that you'll hear about at this show, I think all of our teams use them to one extent or the other. As I said, each team gets to pick the ones that work best for them. So some teams are deeply into value stream mapping. Other teams are like, not for us.
But does that help during the Does that help during the compliance process though, when the auditors come in and?
I haven't seen that, but honestly, so the teams that are doing it, we would provide those maps to the auditors. Most of our teams have a roadmap of some kind. And so, of course, we provide it. What the auditor gets out of it, I'm not always certain.
I find that value stream mapping is becoming more popular with teams that are trying to modernize legacy systems so that they can start to identify what is sort of old vestigial processes that maybe are not necessarily relevant anymore, and what do they want the future process to look like so that the system and the future process can go hand in hand as opposed to recreating something that may be archaic at this point. So
for us, if we want to get a missile out the door, really we have to understand the entire value stream to get that missile out the door safely, right? So an auditor needs to be able to understand, right, what went into it and how they know this is going to go to the right place. Same thing with the aircraft, same thing with our submarines. So actually, in order to deliver safe systems that actually have life-critical impacts, it's been critical for our teams to be able to do value stream, right, against the hardware and the software. What are all the things I need to do to get this thing out the door?
Yeah. We don't call it value stream mapping, but one of the things that we're doing for Ellis and one of our other programs is what's called operational testing. And operational testing goes back to your operational requirements document, which is one of the documents that they must do if they're designated for that activity. That sets key performance parameters, measures of sustainment, measures of performance, et cetera, measures of cyber now. And those key metrics are some of the value stream items. Again, we don't call them value stream, but that's what they are. And we do trace to those. So that's very, very, very important for the auditors.
So another consideration that I've heard a lot of companies worry about is that, you know, as they go through that whole digital transformation, they're adopting new technologies, new ways of doing things. They're moving to the cloud. They're doing all these things that, you know, moving off these traditional on-premises legacy systems. So was that an issue for your organization when you were moving to the DevOps way of doing things?
Sure. I mean, it was an issue when we moved to Agile. It was all new.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, but I don't know, maybe it's not so surprising, but I was a little surprised at how quickly our business owners became comfortable with it. I guess it's a lot different. So people who were accustomed to waiting 18 months to get a requirement to deployment, now they were getting it in 2 to 4 weeks. And that really raises the trust that they see. And it also means that they're free. They don't have to map out 18 months worth of requirements and wait to get them all. They can map out 2 weeks worth. And if they get those, then they can look at it again and say, you know what I thought was going to be my next highest requirement isn't my next highest requirement anymore. Something else is more important. And when they get that, they get even more trust. And they really seem to like it.
I think some of that has to do with the consumerization of IT in general. You know, they start to expect certain things to happen sooner than than the corporate world traditionally has worked. So,
yeah, one of the other measures of that Melinda talked about in our presentation was that what we see is typically you have items that are must-haves, but then you get a lot of other items that are wannas. And as they prioritize those wannas stay in that product backlog for a long time. So we've worked with our teams to say, you know, you had that wanna about a year ago and you haven't wanted it enough to put it on the backlog. Can we delete it? and they're beginning to say yes. And so getting them to realize that all that stuff that they, you know, when they had to wait 18 months for it, it was like, okay, I want the gold plating. Well, now they don't want the gold plating. They want the stuff that really matters.
Makes sense. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time, but thank you all for joining me today and talking about this. There's obviously different considerations for every industry, and the highly regulated industries are particularly interesting to hear the stories about. So thank you very much for sharing with me your stories. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.